Thanks, Andre. So I just put together a few slides over here just to give you a sense of some of the dimensions of the portfolio and how we look at it. Before I get into this, actually, maybe I just should mention one of the programs which people have, I think, liked a lot and has been very positive in terms of the interest it's engendered in global health, which is our Grand Challenges program. So we have this program, Grand Challenges Exploration, whereby we put out calls and we take a huge diversity of potential exotic solutions and would fund those at about $100,000 to get seed ideas. We do about 60 of those a year. And then of the best ones, we would select that would go into a second round for more substantial funding. And as much as that it's fairly limited initial funding, it has engendered, as I say, tremendous enthusiasm, particularly amongst young investigators, young scientists, social scientists, in many cases. We just have our annual meeting coming up, which is being held this year in Ottawa, in Canada, because Canada has participated with us with their own funding of Grand Challenges. It's also extended to Brazil, so it seems to be a type of exercise which has got a lot of traction. But that is separate from this, which is about the mainstream of what we're doing. So just in terms of how do we look at the portfolio? This is an example of the MENAFRAVAC program, which let's not step into that. So I put up a slide over here, which is somewhat dry, although visually interesting slide, which represents our portfolio in some way, but I need to explain to you what it means. The way that we're looking at things is because we have so many different diverse opportunities to invest in from a funding perspective, we need to have some language, some common language around which we evaluate these in some way. Not that we are going to have some rigid grading system and nothing can be changed, but just to have a general sense of where value lies. So we've been using a fairly common summary measure of disability-adjusted life years. And we're looking at a cost effectiveness for a particular intervention or product or idea. So it's the cost per DALY averted. And if I put it to you that if you can avert a DALY for $100, then that's very cost effective. That's a tremendous investment. And we try to be relatively agnostic about where we would actually make those investments. But so you can see over here, these are a variety of, some of them titled, some of them look pretty puzzling. But in over here are things like the malaria vaccine, RTSS, you can see up there. Maybe I can indicate it. So that would be the malaria vaccine. This is a pneumonia whole cell vaccine, which would be tremendously effective. You can see this is, in fact, cost effective, so it takes cost out of the system if we could make it. And the reason for that is it would be incredibly cheap to produce. A whole cell killed pneumonia vaccine would replace all the expensive conjugated vaccines over there. These are the HIV vaccines, and you have some TB combinations over here. Down here you see this is a hookworm vaccine, and this is HIV antibody strategy. So, we can go into some of the details of what these individual bubbles represent, but more let me just give you an idea of the structure of this. So this over here represents 100 million DALYs averted. So something, that's a lot. That's a huge amount. So you can see these bigger bubbles over here are measurable against this benchmark. So these are huge potential gains if we would be successful with these products. And the smaller ones, obviously, are much less than that. We did want to ground everything in reality, things that we already have that we know are very effective. And you see over here on the right-hand side, bed nets, which are deployed and are very effective and very cost-effective, as you can see, for malaria eradication, ultimately. Surgical male circumcision, which is our most effective proven technique for preventing transmission of HIV/AIDS, and which just needs to be scaled up and has huge potential over here. So we put in these two benchmarks, and when a new proposal comes to us, we would like to say, how does this measure out against the things that we know, very practical things we know are effective? And, do you rather give a family a third bed net, or do we do this intervention? We always have that option. Do we rather put more investment into scaling up male surgical circumcision in Southern Africa, which we've been doing, or do we make this new investment? So I think a lot of our investments are really grounded in that very practical perspective. You can just have that perspective of what is the potential value of this new intervention, this new proposal, this new idea, which is one thing. But then there's the other question of, is it likely to work? So there, we get a lot of very interesting proposals, and I find it very exciting to read through some of the proposals we get. But you can say, well, this looks like a very intractable scientific proposition, and if I were to estimate, this could be decades away from being realized. And a little bit along Chris's indication, we do want to accelerate these products for the poorest communities that we work with. Something that is 50 years out, it seems very distant. And that's built into some of these measures as well, which are projecting out what the world is going to look out. This is over the period 2012 to 2050 is where we're looking out with this graphic over here, 2050. It looks out to. So what you see arrayed over here, this probability of success as well, where it's a little bit subjective. I mean, it is based on the data we have of, if you come along with, say, a new drug which is in phase 1, what is the likelihood that ultimately this is going to get through the system? Or you have a new device which is still in testing in the laboratory. What is the likelihood that that device is ultimately going to emerge? So we array these various products or interventions on this probability of success, which is probably the most subjective element of this. But we also don't want to be investing everything in various ventures that have got less than 5% chance of ever being realized, because if the pharmaceutical industry has taught us anything on the productivity front with all of their investments, they've not had tremendous productivity over the last 10 years. Now, we don't want to fall into that same trap. So that is our view of the portfolio. But there are a couple of elements in terms of research and development of how we actually looking at structuring how we progress that portfolio. Good to have a lot of ideas bubbling out there, but we need to see some progress in a systematic way. And if I just put the problem to you. So if you look at this over here, we have probability that we are going to be successful. And you see a particular curve over here, which is the probability of success is ramping up very late in the day over there. Now, when you look at the right-hand side over here, you can see the costs of things. And what you can see is that when you get into these late phases of development of virtually any product, you are in a Everest of cost that you've just scaled. You came from your early research phases over here, which were relatively cheap, and suddenly you're doing very large studies, global studies, and those are tremendously expensive. If you run into those studies with this kind of likelihood of being successful, then that means that you are carrying into the very expensive phases a relatively low probability that you're going to actually be successful. And once again, along this thinking that if you are doing that, then you're going to have a lot of failures, and they're going to be expensive failures late in the game. So we are very interested in how we can actually shift that probability of being successful into the earlier, cheaper parts. So ideas that have got inherently built into them the opportunity to check, does this actually work in a fairly small scale, are ideas that we really like a lot, because they have that element of being much more confident that the big investment late in the game is going to actually pan out. So we definitely have a strong preference for these kinds of ideas. The other advantage is if we can really separate this thinking early on, try and prove things that they're really going to work, we can do a lot more on the early stage. So we take one of those late stage, very risky ventures costing 100 million, now turn that same money back into the early stages. We can finance an awful lot of fairly small, $1 million scale, interesting ideas, and have the opportunity of then picking those which look more certain to succeed. So I think this is the strategy that we are executing, which we believe is more likely to lead to ultimately us having greater productivity and producing interesting things for our communities at the end of the day. If your funding fits into that type of picture, if your ideas fit into this kind of framework, then I think that really will facilitate the dialogue with our teams now who are starting to try and impose this type of rigor on how we move forward. So with that, I think I did just want to highlight one other element of our funding approach, which is a little bit of a change from what we've done. So we clearly, in working particularly with academic institutions, multilateral organizations, with our funding partners, we work with the traditional grant-based funding mechanism. We make a philanthropic grant to support some body of work. We've also been working with some more market-based mechanisms. So we've also done some investments, which we call program-related investments, PRIs, whereby we've actually, for instance, made equity investments in startup companies. This is a great example that I'm tremendously excited about. It's a little company called Atreca, which came out of a university, initially with just 3 investigators, and they have an idea of how they can comprehensively profile the B-cell immune response to any infectious process. And they can do it in an unbiased way, so you don't need to know what the immune system was reacting against. You're going to be able to find that out. And it is a technology that evolved out of just being able to go to scale on some of the new buzz themes like deep sequencing. Just when you got to a certain scale of profiling, you could do this. But they needed some funding to get this off the ground. So we made an investment in them with the idea that we are not interested in a return on that investment. What we were interested in capturing was, before other companies came along and got hold of this asset, that we would buy the global health access rights. So that this could be used by the global health community broadly for global health problems. And we specified the countries for which we want access and the diseases for which we're interested in using the technology. So they are free to commercialize this in Europe and in the US. They're not encumbered, but specifically for global health purpose, we have bought out the rights for this. So that's another approach that we've been taking. So if you would have startup company ideas, then that's another avenue that you can approach us on, and we would be interested in thinking about those. So I'll stop there and take any questions you might have.
Right, thank you, Trevor. Right, so the floor is open for questions for Trevor at this stage. I'm going to take 3 at a time if we have those. Remember the rules, please, your name, affiliation, and not too long. So there must be questions. I can't believe it. We've set this up and there's no question. No question. Yes, across here.
Good afternoon. I'm Aulo Jelly from Imperial College. Just because you mentioned nutrition, I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about how you're looking at nutrition, and also the links between the work on nutrition that your colleagues are doing, that you mentioned in agriculture, for instance.
So nutrition has got many dimensions. So I'll give you more the sort of research and development component that we're looking at, which is pretty broad. So we're certainly interested in better understanding the components of good and necessary nutrition for kids under the age of 5, which includes actually nutrition for mothers that would be helpful to their kids. So what micronutrients precisely do you need, and can we supplement those in ways that are cost effective? We've just been working on some very novel salt supplements that go beyond fluoride and iron. And it's very difficult to add vitamin A into salt, as it turns out, and make that cheap and make that any kind of salt that you'd ever want to use in your regular diet. So we're looking at these factors of, what we can actually supplement or augment diets with that would be beneficial. We're also looking trying to understand better the connection between deficient nutrition and problems later in life. So, for instance, what seems like an intuitive linkage between stunting and cognitive impairment in later life. We invested in a sizable study, the MALI-D study, to try and tease out better as much as people have suspected that this is the case, and intuitively you say, well, surely stunting is associated with some cognitive deficits. It's not actually been proven that is the case, and to what extent those are recoverable. So we have an extensive study to try and understand that, and when interventions, would still be useful in that regard. On the agricultural front, we have a broad range of programs around enrichment of various food types, from golden rice to various other food, cassava, various other food crops that we are thinking of trying to enrich in some ways by engineering them, which in and of itself is an issue, but seems to work in some cases. Yes, so some of the elements of nutrition, but a fairly broad interest in that. Obviously, I would say that if you were to ask me what really matters, I would say getting a good set of vaccines into the expanded, program of immunization and good nutrition. We've probably taken care in terms of the under 5-year-old health and developmental problems of a large piece of it.
Thank you. Oh, good. I'm quite relieved. At the front here, Angela, there's 2, and then we'll take the one at the back. We could do all 3 in a row, and then if Trevor, you can remember those.
Okay.
Hello? Yeah. My name is Peter Potter-Lesage. I'm from MMV, Medicines for Malaria Venture in Geneva. And I have a question. I think that the idea of shifting the probability of being successful with the predictors of success, I think it's absolutely fascinating. I was wondering if you had perhaps already some examples you could possibly give us of certain organizations which may have already done this. And a second sort of sub-question, if I may, which is, would you happen to be able to give us some update on GHIF, another PRI initiative, the Global Health Investment Fund? Thank you.
I saw the look of panic, Trevor. Answer it straight off if you like.
Yeah. This is a little bit complex. Well, the first question, I think that, Peter, coming from Medicines for Malaria Ventures, you've got a fantastic example within your remit in terms of the shifting the probabilities. So for malaria, we have this unusual example, which makes me so confident that as much as with the first vaccine, we've seen modest activity, we're going to get a great vaccine out, certainly in the second generation, which is the fact that we can actually give healthy people malaria. And there are people who are willing for the global health purpose to be subjected to receiving a shot of malaria, parasite, developing malaria, and participating in a drug or a vaccine study, and then being cured. So far it's been completely safe because we can cure you. We know what you've got. But this means that we can do studies on cohorts of 20 to 30 people, and we can do it in a couple of weeks, actually. So we can turn these massive drug programs into a challenge model, 20 to 30 people studied for a few weeks, and we can know pretty definitively, does the vaccine or does the drug really work? And that's been a fantastic. In fact, that's one area that we are very invested in expanding. It turns out that one of the most productive units that has been running that challenge model is Adrian Hill's unit at the Oxford Jenner Institute. And he's been very successful in quickly turning around a lot of different constructs for vaccines in that model. Same thing applies to drugs. So that's a good example of, I think, of how you can practically change this curve that I showed you. On the GHIF, this is another investment vehicle that we've set up. And it's an investment fund where we've been seeking contributions from high net worth individuals, but open actually to other organizations and even some companies that wanted to participate. And it's a fund whereby we would be able to make investments in, for instance, late stage development for an important product. Let's say it was a new TB drug. This could be, a company could apply to the GHIF for a loan effectively, and the return on that loan would be at a much less than market rate. So the investors in the fund are accepting that they would get some return, but it's going to be much less than if they went and they invested in Fidelity or one of these investment instruments. But they will make their wealth, or companies will make this fund available for use for global health purpose. And we see that as a way in which we can fund some of the very expensive later stage developments which go beyond just making a small equity investment. That fund, it's been open now for, 6 months or so. It's close to closing. Our initial, we'll do more, I think, if that works out well. So far, it looks very interesting. But it's a fairly limited fund in the first instance. I think it's about $100 million. And we'll see how that goes. It'll close soon. If you want to invest in, it's pretty close to closing.
Thank you. This one, lady on the front, please.
Hello, I'm Michelle Joannis. I work with DNDI, and I'm the head of fundraising there. Just joined 7 weeks ago. From Canada, McGill University, which is where I used to work. Just a quick question on the diseases that you listed. Is kinetoplastids and helminths still part of some of the priorities at Gates?
So absolutely. Just to reassure you. So certainly there are some neglected infectious diseases. Chris mentioned the round table, the summit that we had earlier here in London, a commitment to these diseases, which cause a substantial burden. In some cases, it's absolutely known, leishmania, Kala-Azar, 500,000 cases a year at least. And in the regions that it occurs in rural Bihar in India, for instance, where there's little access to medication, if you develop it and you're not treated, it's fairly deadly and very disabling. So there are these diseases, and nobody's really working on that, which we are very committed to working on. Some of the other worm infestations, parasitic infections, which have got a burden which is not well characterized. So you may have seen some of the bubbles, may not have looked that large. So the ground-borne nematodes that people pick up, they may not kill you, but the massive degree of anemia that they cause in young kids, we're really not quantitated what the impact of that is, say, on cognitive development, on general development. So I would say that we understand that there's a massive problem over there, which is really not quantitated, which is why that graph that I showed, the portfolio picture, is so imprecise. And we don't take that as a rigid guide to absolutely what we're going to do. If we haven't measured something well, and we have not with these kind of helminthic infections, absolutely not, we should still be funding those very substantially because their burden is pretty clear. You just need to visit some of those areas to understand that.
Thank you. There was a gentleman at the back. Right at the back.
No, I better get up because otherwise you won't see me. My name is Michael Crawford. I'm from reproductive physiology at Imperial College. And I wanted to return to the first speaker's first question and your reference to cognitive development, which is really important because if you think of the circles that you described in terms of potential benefits, in terms of money, I would guess that mental ill health and brain disorders would practically fill the whole screen and blot out all the things that you're talking about, because it is now, unfortunately, the strongest and biggest cost in the health of the West, and increasingly being globalized. But the point I want to make is that the reference to the nutrition and health of the under 5-year-old is commonly referred to. But in fact, the brain develops before the child is born. So in fact, what you're talking about here is that a lot of funding agencies are focusing on the child, which is in fact closing the stable door after the horse is bolted. Because the real problem lies with maternal health and nutrition before the child is born. And it would be really rather good to see more emphasis put on that aspect, because it's certainly neglected in most of the funding organizations. Thank you.
So, Michael, point well taken, and certainly, understanding that we do have a substantial program in maternal neonatal health, which actually spreads out to many of our programs. We understand that, for instance, mothers may be the best way to actually provide vaccines to neonates and to young kids. So we did this mother's gift study for influenza, where we actually gave the influenza vaccine to mothers, to pregnant mothers, and showed a very substantial reduction in influenza problems in very young kids. So I think that, mothers are, a point of access both on the nutrition access and other elements of health, malaria as well, for instance. So treatment of mothers has a definite impact. Uterine placental malaria seems to be a very specific entity which we need to address.
Thank you. There's a gentleman in the back row who's mugged the assistant for the microphone.
Yes, Javier Guzman from Policy Cures. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's very interesting that we see some probability of success and some measure of impact. My question is about, one, whether you consider the cost of development, whether you consider how developed is the technology, and whether that's factoring the equation. And the second thing is whether you consider also what other funders are doing and the degree of market failure that you see for the different diseases.
Yeah, so in terms of how we came up with these numbers, it's all based on the global burden of disease, which the 2010 update, I think, is going to be released here in London in a short while, a week or two. So that has been one of the bases. And that's certainly feeding into the model over there is the cost of development of each of those entities. It turns out that the cost of development is actually very small in relation to the cost of delivery. Cost of delivery is also fed into these numbers. I think that is probably where a lot of the imprecision comes in, because cost of delivery dwarfs cost of development, but cost of delivery is a much more difficult thing to estimate. So that's where a lot of the imprecision in the numbers come about. Your other question was around, if you can just repeat the last part of it you want to know.
Well, just talking about whether you consider what other funders are doing and the degree of market failure, how industry is involved or not.
Right. So the one thing I just would want to caution people about in terms of putting up this portfolio and talking about the mechanism of how we're doing this. So we operate virtually entirely through partners, product development partners and other partners. It's not that we are somehow setting up a new entity and a company. My group is about 180 people, and that's about as big as it's going to ever get. So that may seem like quite a lot, but in terms of the vast portfolio we have, they can barely sustain all of the applications we get for various grants. So we are very much dependent on the excellent partners we've had in the past and the ones we'll have in the future. Those partners include commercial partners in the pharmaceutical biotech space as well. And I think we've had a lot of traction, and increasing traction in the last year or two, in terms of a forum that we've developed, our CEO roundtable, where we get the major pharmaceutical and sometimes device manufacturers to join us for a session of discussion around what have they done and what have they not done in the space and what could they do. And I think they've been increasingly forthcoming as they've understood that it's not just from a corporate social responsibility perspective, and that's not the only axis on which we want them to do things, there's actually a lot of other value that can accrue to them for working with us, just in terms of the experience of getting into countries. You may look at Africa in terms of the poorest countries. It's also got some of the fastest growing countries in the world. So when these companies are looking at growth opportunities, there are many countries in Africa that are the best growth opportunities for their portfolios. So they're very interested in efforts like the East African harmonization effort, where instead of them having to individually try and register their products in every country in East Africa, we've pulled with our partners 5 East African countries together to have a harmonized process like the European Medicines Association Agency, the EMA, where you've got the common approval policy. So I think that, in terms of market failure, we're seeing a little bit of a switch over here to a lot of thoughts on the pharmaceutical, on the industry side, to market opportunity, actually. And yes, we'll bridge things. There are still issues around costs. Our biggest partner in the vaccine space, the biggest volume producer of vaccines on the planet, is Serum Institute of India, which is not really a household name in terms of vaccines, particularly not in the developed countries. But we'll support groups like that to produce the highly cost-effective vaccines for the countries that we're interested in.
Thank you. Just one final question. Lady down the front here, third row from the front.
I'm Dina Balabanova from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I just have a question regarding your theory of change. This is something we see increasingly in recent proposals. So I just wanted to see your thinking around that. Obviously, it's all about impact, but sometimes developing innovations could be disruptive of current policy patterns and engagement with current processes. So how do you see this balance?
Well, I think there's been some evolution of the theory of change. And really, I would say that it's really evolving into this concept of more outcome-based philanthropy, whereby we really are focused on what the outcomes are. And once we understand what the outcome or the impact is that we'd like to have, then we have to design the policy changes and the partnerships that are going to produce that outcome. And the consequence of that approach in being very focused on outcome and not sort of input into the system is it means that we need to have a very extensive dialogue with our partners up front, so that up front we have a general agreement, alignment around what the game plan is. Because I also believe that if you have good partners and you are really outcome focused, the worst thing you can do is to sort of hover over them as they're trying to execute and be calling up every second day to try and find out what they're doing. Put milestones. Initially when we started to say, well, we really want to be outcome focused, a number of my teams came back with the partners with extensive lists of milestones. Almost every week there'd be a check-in as to what step you took next, which is absolutely the death knell of moving towards expeditiously to an outcome. But it does mean this different mode of upfront getting a broad alignment around what are the policy changes we need, what is the general structure, what is the general strategy, and putting some meaningful few milestones in the system, but then focusing on the outcome.
Okay, thank you. Trevor, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to call in here during your visit. The UK certainly does have leading edge global health community, so I think they've very much appreciated the time you've taken to come and present.